Hello and welcome to episode 28 of Creative Walks. My name is Pedro Bonatto and I have been doing this podcast for about a month now, even though this is episode 28. I actually missed a few days, which is actually the subject of today's episode. But I have received a few positive comments from listeners. As I mentioned before, we had about 200 people listening to this, if the statistics are to be trusted, but I haven't had a question submitted yet until today. So I was very happy when I found on my inbox a friend of mine sending me a question, and I decided that this episode will be all about that. So the listener, who is a fellow artist, has asked, how are you finding having to do it daily, meaning this podcast? And I think that's a very important question because it relates to the practice of doing creative things daily, and most of all, committing to them. And actually answering this question is one of the reasons I decided to create this podcast as a daily project. It could have been weekly or whenever I felt in the mood, but for some reason I felt that it would be beneficial both for me and for listeners to have this as a daily exercise. And I am the first to admit that I am the poster boy for inconsistency. So I must admit, of course, I slacked off for a few days, even in this 30 days. And it's hard to do things every day because in my case, sometimes you feel silly or you feel that no one cares and you have all these mind games that you play with yourself. But whenever I get down to actually recording, I really do enjoy it because these are all subjects that I deeply care about and they're things I'm trying to figure out, so I find them incredibly interesting. I know that for us as artists, we usually suffer from procrastination of some sort. And that manifests in many ways, like from perfectionism, like, oh, I need to get this perfectly before I deliver to the world, to sabotaging yourself with whatever your poison of choice, right? With booze, parties, or watching TV, or whatever else you do not to do the work. So for me, as a photographer and a musician, or even if you're a painter, a sculptor, a dancer, usually artworks are not expected to be created, completed, and delivered every day. And I mean, you create artworks sometimes for months or years. And the problem with that is that you get so used to stretching your deadlines. When you have deadlines at all, sometimes you're just working on whatever you're working and it keeps being postponed and later and later and later. And I think doing something creative daily and actually showing it is a fantastic exercise and has many not obvious benefits. Just as an anecdote that I remember today, many years ago, Brazilian writer Paulo Coelho, the author of the famous Alchemist, he used to have a daily column in one of the country's largest newspapers called Maktub, which means, I think, it's written in Arabic. And they were like these very short, interesting little stories, lessons, anecdotes, and I remember saving them for a long time and reading them over time. And I always thought it was so interesting that I was, I think, about 22 or 23 when he was doing that. And how the hell does this guy find the time and the strength, most of all, and the enthusiasm to do this column every day? He certainly doesn't need the money. He's already famous. He can write a book whenever he wants. So why is he committing to doing this column daily? Especially because, as I thought, a writer, he is going to want to have this written and rewritten and have it shown only when it's completely polished. And the quality of the writing actually changed from day to day. There were days that it was really inspiring. Sometimes it looked like filler. But it took me starting this podcast daily to start seeing what was the benefit of it. This podcast that is not even a month old yet, and certainly not done perfectly, has shown me some benefits and a realization that there is some very magical things that happen when you start creating daily creative practices. The first, and I didn't know this would happen, is that doing something every day teaches you not to make excuses and actually find solutions to make the thing happen. And even when it doesn't happen, at least you identify that what you're doing is an excuse not to deliver. And that in itself is already super valuable because you can apply those lessons because you see that mode of thinking and you realize, oh, I'm creating an excuse because you've done that experiment daily because you have to fight that dragon every day. It's like you brush your teeth every day, you shower, you eat, hopefully. So when you decide to postpone something to another day, something you decided that you actually have to do every day, you start noticing that those are all mind games. You start also paying attention to all the other things that are not priorities that are actually consuming your time. So instead of beating yourself up, you learn how to find ways to deliver, and hopefully over time this will become a second nature. Speaking of second nature, the second thing that I thought would be a good realization to share with you guys is that like with longer projects, doing something creative every day will make you doubt yourself. I routinely think that it would be better off if I would spend my time somewhere else. There's certainly other things I must do every day and projects that I need to complete. But even if this takes whatever, like 30, 40 minutes in total in the day, it's still time. And you keep thinking, at least in my case, who would find these thoughts interesting, or these tips, or these experiences of any value? No one will care. This is just a waste of time. All these things get these nagging voices keep coming back to your mind. But since you have to do it every day, you basically go and you do it. And of course, whenever I receive messages from people that they are enjoying, they're taking value out of it, of course, I find it refreshing and encouraging. So, but it shouldn't depend on that. It should be something that you do just because you have to do it. So I think that attitude of dealing with all these doubts you have about yourself actually help with longer projects and more difficult projects, especially when you hit a block on them. So I think what it showed me is that it's like a gym for your creativity. Like in the beginning it's difficult, but you slowly start seeing the results. And third and finally, the benefit that I'm thinking of is that doing something like this podcast daily, but it can be any kind of art form, like writing or sketching or dancing or poetry or photography or whatever you're called to do. It will bring you new ideas you didn't know existed, you didn't expect, and I think they would not appear that clearly if you were like thinking of it whenever it appeared in your mind. Because ideas, if you do something daily, ideas will surface, sometimes new, and sometimes some ideas will come again, and they will call attention to what's really on your mind, things that you don't expect. And that hopefully will help inform other art projects that you want to do. For example, today when I was coming back from the gym, I started having all these ideas about these other projects and things that I usually don't permit myself doing because I have many ideas throughout the day, but I know that I will go into rabbit holes of trying to figure them out when I have a list of 10 pending projects still to do, still on the thought process. But today I said, let me see where they go. And then I came up with 4 or 5 different projects that actually linked very nicely to things that I'm doing now. And I know that they will inspire me, or at least I hope that they will inspire me to make those other projects that I was thinking even more interesting and more engaging. So if you decide to do something creative every day, and I mean this is sort of like the say, practical part of it. And by doing something creative every day, I don't mean something that you do and you put on your closet and no one sees, like a journal or something like that. That's very important and very cool too, as self-exploration. But what I mean is creating some sort of output every day. So here are 3 suggestions on choosing what to do. If you wanted to do the Mona Lisa every day, you would not be able to, no one would. So I would suggest doing something that is not that time consuming, something that, for example, with this episode, something that is between 5 and 20, 30 minutes, but something that doesn't consume that much of your time every day. And for example, in my case, it's these spontaneous thoughts that come to mind. And sometimes I have a rough guide of what I want to talk about. And sometimes I have to read a quote, so I have it on the notes on my phone or on my computer, see if I'm like around. So those things are easy to do. So it has to be that kind of format, something short. Second, I would suggest to make this into a form of conversation. So you turn your artwork, be it photography, dance, whatever, into a conversation piece, literally. Meaning you imagine 1 or 2 people that you would like to talk about the specific things that you're interested in, and you create the content with the intent of talking to that person. Not that you would only show that person, but you have that person in mind. And having them on your mind will help you create the content. It will help you bypass the fear of putting your work out there. And you can say explicitly that this is your open studio, this is your work in progress, this may go to the trash can. But there will be a lot of people that will be interested in it. And even if there's just a few, they may eventually be clients, or they may be eventually collaborators or friends. So there is only upside to that. Doesn't matter how large your audience will be. Thirdly, commit to doing this for a fixed number of days. Then you extend it if you want. So you can decide to do like a 7-day challenge or a 30-day challenge to create something. Or you can do something that designer Ella Luna does, that is the 100 days of making. So you can Google that. It's kind of interesting. And I think I actually will try that 100 days of making. Finally, this question reminds me of a quote by Andre Agassi, who is a fantastic tennis player. And on his book, Open, he talked about being tired all the time and how he was like sick of the grind. And there was a quote by Gil, I forgot his last name, but he was his coach. And I think this quote applies to art as much as it applies to sports. And here is the quote. There is a lot of good waiting for you on the other side of tired. Get yourself tired, Andre. That's where you're going to know yourself, on the other side of tired. And I think the tennis analogy in this quote for artists is a very appropriate one. For tennis players, that means going to the court and hitting the gym. And for us as artists, it's making things. When a tennis player practices in the court, they have instant feedback on what they're working on, what's working, what's not working, my slice, my serve, my topspin, all those things. But we as artists, it's like as if we are tennis players that only think about tennis and go to the Grand Slam and expect to play perfectly. So I think we gotta hit those creative serves every day. And I think that comes in the form of daily output, even if it's a small one. Finally, the main thing that I got from this podcast so far for doing it daily, along with having interactions with you folks and with hopefully getting value gotten to you, it's actually this insight that I had today, which is we are often burdened by that delta, that distance between what we have done in our lives and what we think we should have done. And all those should haves they change the perspective of what we can actually do. And again, those are mind games. They distort the personal stories that we tell ourselves on what we are capable of. And doing something everyday creative is an antidote for that. So I hope you found this useful. Thank you again for submitting your first question to the podcast. I'm looking forward to hearing from you always. You can find me at Pedro Bonatto with 2 T's on all social media, and I'll see you tomorrow.